The first time I saw it, I remember the way the light refused to warm that ice. A narrow beam from a headlamp sliced up into a vaulted ceiling of blue, and there, suspended above the beam, was the dark shape of a body pressed into crystal like something trapped in old glass. The ice around it was so clear you could see air bubbles and tiny fractures, a shimmering world inside a world. But that figure stayed stubbornly still, upside down, boots toward the opening, head buried in shadow. The cave itself swallowed every sound. Even the soft click of carabiners seemed too loud, like noise that didn't belong down there. Frost clung to the walls in delicate feathers, and the cold bit straight through my gloves when I touched the rock near the entrance. For a long second, in one of those photographs, the rope lines looked almost like veins running up into the ice and disappearing around that frozen silhouette. You couldn't see a face, not really just the hint of a red sleeve and the curve of a shoulder. It was the kind of image that doesn't shout at you. It just settles into your chest and waits. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from, and follow if you believe some names should never fade. Most of you haven't been to Birch Landing, and that's probably for the best. It's not much more than a gas station, a diner, a few weather-beaten houses, and a strip of gravel road that dead-ends into the airstrip where the bush planes take off for the mountain. In early summer, when this story begins, the town smells like thawing earth and jet fuel spruce needles warming in the sun and the faint sourness of snowmelt pooling in the ditches. The light lingers late that time of year, hanging low and gold over the river so long that you forget what a real night feels like until October. You hear tires crunching on gravel, the distant cough of a small engine starting the occasional thud of boots on wooden porch steps. Life moves slow on the surface, but everything important up here is tied to the weather report and whatever the mountain decides to do. My days back then started before the first tourist alarm clock ever went off. The cabin I was renting sat just off the main road, close enough to hear the fuel trucks grumble by, far enough that when I opened my door in the morning, the first thing I smelled was damp moss and cold river air. I'd stand on the porch, mug of coffee burning my fingers, watching a low band of fog crawl along the tree line while the sun tried to punch through from the east. Inside, the radio murmured out the latest forecast, that same tinny voice listing wind speeds and freezing levels, as if he were talking about grocery prices instead of whether somebody would make it home that week. I checked gear, the way other people checked email gloves, worn thin ropes for fuzzy spots, harness buckles for grit you could feel under your fingertips. The habit of running my hands along webbing and steel had become as automatic as breathing. Rachel lived a little farther out, closer to the river, in a small cabin she'd finished herself over a few scattered summers. If you drove out there, you'd know which place was hers by the neat stacks of firewood under the eaves and the red thermos usually sitting on the porch rail, still beading with condensation when she walked out. Even before you saw her, you heard the heavy thunk of her boots on the wooden steps and the quiet jangle of hardware as she shrugged into one of those battered jackets that always looked a size too big. She wasn't loud, didn't fill space with stories the way some guides did. She had a calm kind of presence, like a steady lamp in a storm. Warm contained no wasted motion. To the tourists and newer climbers, Rachel was Monroe, the guide who never forgot a tie-down or a spare canister. To me, she was just Rach. We met years before this on a windy ridge covered in rime ice when my glove slipped during a traverse and her hand closed around my wrist before I'd even registered the slide. Her grip then had felt exactly like her voice usually sounded, firm, no drama, no comments about how close that had been. Just a quiet, got you carried over the wind before she hauled me back to solid footing. After that, we kept ending up on the same expeditions, the same lousy weather emergencies, and the same bar stools when the season ended and the tourists flew home. If you walked into our little world in early June of 2018, you'd have seen ordinary, almost boring routines. Planes went up, planes came down, propellers whining against the bright sky. Guides checked manifests with pens between their teeth. The diner windows steamed up from coffee pots and bacon grease, and the screen door sighed shut behind every new customer. On the bulletin board by the cash register, somebody had taped up a laminated chart of Denali routes, the ink a little sun-faded, the corners curling. Locals argued over snowpack levels the way other people argue about sports. When the afternoon flights came in, you could taste dust in the air from the sudden spin of the bush planes touching down. Rachel liked to claim she wasn't sentimental about the mountain, but that wasn't quite true. She didn't talk about Denali like some mystical altar the way visiting climbers did. She talked about elevations and aspects about snow bridges and wind slabs and barometric pressure. But the way she folded her maps told you enough. Each sheet was creased with a kind of deliberate care, her fingers smoothing the paper flat before she slid it into a clear sleeve. Her journals were full of numbers, temperatures times route notes, but there'd be a line every so often about the way the light looked on a certain ridge at 4:30 a.m., or the way the wind dropped so suddenly it felt like someone had shut a door on the sky. If you sat close enough, you could smell the faint mix of chalk-cold metal and pine soap that clung to her after a day at the gear station. That spring, she had been talking more about going back to the Kahiltna Glacier, working a solo route, and then transitioning into a season of guiding. I remember her standing in the doorway of the gear shed one cool morning, a tape measure clipped to her belt, watching a cloud bank slide over the mountain like someone pulling a blanket. The air in there smelled like nylon and old sweat rubber and aluminum. She'd picked up a new coil of rope and run it through her hands, checking for imperfections the manufacturer's inspection had already missed. "They keep changing the colors," she'd said half to herself, the bright blue line passing over her fingers. But nylon is nylon. It either holds or it doesn't. Evenings in Birch Landing followed their own slow rhythm. The light would turn softer, sliding across the gravel road and catching on windshields and window glass. Someone would start up a generator behind one of the outbuildings, the low hum settling into the background like distant traffic. In town, you'd hear laughter spilling out of the bar near the airstrip, the clink of a cue ball, the crack of a pool shot, chairs scraping on worn wood floors. Out by the river, it was different. You could hear the water more clearly at night, that rough, constant rush broken occasionally by the slap of something, maybe a beaver, maybe a branch hitting the current. Rachel and I spent a lot of those evenings sitting on my porch or hers boots up on the railing, mugs in our hands. Sometimes it was coffee, sometimes something stronger poured over too much ice. You could smell wood smoke from someone's stove down the road mixed with that metallic tang of river air. We'd talk about nothing and everything, clients who wore their crampons backward, the new ranger fresh out of the academy, some guide out of Seattle who thought altitude sickness was a mindset issue. Every once in a while, her voice would drift and she'd go quiet in the middle of a sentence, eyes turned toward the dark outline of the peaks. She always came back, but those pauses started showing up more that year. I remember one particular afternoon before her last climb, the kind of day where the air feels thin and brittle, sunlight bouncing sharp off every patch of lingering snow. We were in town by the back of the equipment shop sorting harnesses on a wooden table whose grain had been worn smooth by years of use. The place smelled like machine oil and canvas with a hint of stale coffee from a forgotten mug. Inside, I could hear the clatter of tools and the low murmur of someone's radio playing country music that faded in and out. That's when I noticed her rubbing her thumb along the edge of a small black notebook, her route journal, instead of focusing on the gear. "You ever get a smell stuck in your head?" she asked me, still looking at the page. Her voice was even, but she had that tiny crease between her eyebrows that showed up when she was trying to puzzle something out. Like you walk through a place, can't quite see what's going on, but your nose knows something's off. I shrugged, feeling the nylon bite against my fingers as I tugged on a leg loop. "Sure. Like when the stove's leaking and you haven't heard the hiss yet." She gave a small, thin smile at that, but it didn't reach her eyes. "This is more like fertilizer. Wet soil. Too much of it in one spot." She shook her head once, almost dismissing her own words, and flipped the notebook shut with a soft snap. "Probably nothing. Could have been somebody's old campsite." The back door of the shop opened, then letting out a burst of cooler air and the scent of grease and fuel. Dale Harris stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag so stained it might have been any color once. He was one of those guys who seemed built of angles, sharp shoulders, narrow face eyes that didn't settle long in any one place. The sound of his boots on the porch boards had a different weight from most people's, heavier somehow, as if he were carrying more than just himself. "You kids done with that inventory?" he called, voice roughened by years of cold air and cigarettes. The way he said kids had an edge to it, even though he wasn't that much older than us. Almost Rachel answered, slipping the notebook into her jacket pocket. There was a neutral tone to her voice, then polite but not warm. I heard the faint rustle of paper as she moved the notebook sliding against the fabric. Dale's eyes flicked from me to her and back again, lingering for a fraction of a second on the coil of rope she'd been checking. "Don't forget to log those carabiners," he said. "Last thing we need is amateurs hanging from bad steel." He gave a short, humorless chuckle at his own joke, the kind that didn't invite anyone else to laugh. As he turned to go back inside, I caught a whiff of machine oil and something harsher on his jacket, a chemical bite that made me think of cleaning fluid or fuel additives. After the door closed behind him, the shop swallowed his footsteps and the radio drifted back into audibility. Rachel let out a slow breath I might not have noticed if we hadn't been so quiet. The sun slid behind a cloud just then, and the light on the table changed from bright to flat, the colors of the webbing dulling in an instant. "You and Dale okay?" I asked, running a strap through my hand just to have something to do. "We're fine," she said quickly. Too quickly. Then she added with a shrug, "He just likes to show off how much he knows. Some people get territorial about their snowmobiles and their shortcuts. It's not a big deal. If I'd been paying better attention, I might have pushed a little harder." But the wind shifted, bringing in the distant whine of a plane taking off, and she grabbed the last harness, shook it once, and that seemed to close the subject. The small tension in her jaw vanished as she started talking about crampon orders and a client coming up from Texas who'd never seen snow before. Micro cracks. That's what I'd call those moments now. Back then, they felt like nothing at all. The day before her climb, the weather turned almost unnervingly perfect. The air had that clean snap to it you get when a storm has blown through and left everything scrubbed and bright. Sunlight bounced off the snowfields high above us, sending a harsh glare down into town so strong you had to squint stepping out of any doorway. You could smell thawing ground in the lower woods, that rich, dark scent of soil waking up. The radio crackled all morning with excited chatter from pilots and guides. Calm winds, good visibility, freezing levels just where we wanted them. Rachel called me from base camp on the glacier that afternoon. I remember the faint delay in her voice over the static, the occasional hiss of wind cutting across the line. Behind her, I could hear the muffled clank of pots, the low murmur of other climbers, the soft crunch of boots on packed snow. "Conditions are better than the forecast," she said. "Feels like the mountain's actually in a decent mood for once." I could picture her standing there with the phone pressed to her gloved hand, breath slightly clouding the air, the ridgeline sharp against a pale blue sky. We went through the usual checklist route plan, approximate times, backup options. Her answers were crisp, almost cheerful. She said she'd climb to an intermediate camp, spend the night there, then move higher if everything still looked good. I asked her about that weird smell she'd mentioned at the shop, keeping my voice light like I was just poking fun at her nose. Probably nothing she repeated. I heard fabric rustle like she was shifting her weight, maybe turning away from someone walking past. For a heartbeat, the sound around her dropped, and all I could hear was the faint buzz of the line and her breathing in my ear. "I'll tell you about it when I'm back," she added. There was something in the way she said it, quick, almost dismissive, that brushed against me the wrong way. Then the wind picked up on her side, roaring suddenly through the speaker, and her next words broke off in a crackle of static. The line popped once, sharp and loud enough to make me flinch, and then the connection went dead. I pulled the phone back, staring at the blank screen for a second, listening to the quiet hum of the fridge in my cabin and the soft ticking of the wall clock behind me. Outside, a truck rolled past on the gravel, the sound fading into the distance. I told myself it was nothing. Calls dropped all the time from the glacier. The afternoon light was still strong, pouring in through the window and catching dust motes drifting like slow snow in the air. I set the phone down on the table next to her route notes we'd gone over that morning, the paper edges lightly curling from use. I could still smell coffee lingering in the room, gone lukewarm in the pot mixed with the faint odor of damp wool from my drying jacket. That night, the sky over Birch Landing stayed unusually clear, the stars sharp and cold above the dark line of the trees. I left the porch light on out of habit, its yellow cone glowing over the steps and a little patch of dirt where our boot prints overlapped from earlier that week. The air had a bite to it when I opened the door, and the only sounds were the distant rush of the river and the faint rattle of a loose piece of tin somewhere on a neighbor's shed. I sat at the small table by the window radio on low, listening to the soft static and the occasional burst of distant chatter I couldn't quite make out. Sometime after midnight, I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for the radio to crackle with her voice, or for the crunch of tires on the road outside. The porch light cast its steady circle on empty steps, bugs batting themselves against the glass every now and then. The phone lay face down on the table, dark and silent, and the longer it stayed that way, the heavier the quiet in that little cabin seemed to grow. The morning after that broken call, I woke before the alarm. The cabin felt colder than it should have, as if the night had seeped in through the walls. I remember standing in the doorway with my coffee, the steam drifting sideways in a faint breeze, and thinking the world looked strangely hollow. The road was quiet, the river steady, the sky washed pale by early sun. Nothing outwardly wrong. But there was a thin, unsettled pull in my chest I couldn't name yet. I tried calling Rachel right away. The phone barely rang before that clipped recording came on the one every climber knows by heart. The number you're trying to reach is unavailable. I tried again. Same thing. I told myself the signal was just buried under weather or rock, that she'd check in once she moved to a clearer ridge. I'd said those words to worried families for years. It's probably nothing. Let's give it a little more time. But it's different when you're the one saying it to yourself. By mid-morning, the sun had warmed the gravel enough that the dust kicked up as trucks rolled through town. Pilots moved around the airstrip with that lazy confidence of a good weather day. Everything looked normal. I kept checking my phone like a reflex thumb, swiping screen, lighting up nothing new. I told myself I'd wait until noon before I bothered anyone. Noon came too fast. The sky kept widening into a perfect blue, the kind that forces you to squint even behind sunglasses. I rode into town, tires humming on the road, hoping someone else had heard from her. At the gear shop, the door chimed when I pushed it open, and the familiar smells of rubber nylon and machine oil drifted out to meet me. Behind the counter, one of the newer guides was sorting harnesses. He looked up and said, "Morning, Jack," like everything was fine. And maybe it was. Maybe I was just borrowing trouble. I kept my voice casual when I asked if anyone had heard from Rachel. He shook his head, still looping a strap through a buckle. "Nah. She said she'd be out of range a while, didn't she?" He said it lightly, the way people do before they sense anything amiss. I nodded, though I never remembered her saying anything about a long outage. I walked back outside and stood in the sunlight, listening to the faint drone of a bush plane circling overhead. My phone buzzed in my hand. For a second, hope rushed straight through me, sharp, bright, only to collapse when I saw it was just a weather alert, stronger winds expected by nightfall. The kind of wind that knocks radio calls sideways and rattles tents even in sheltered basins. I called again, and again, and again. The recording stayed the same, that flat, indifferent voice cutting through the static. Around 1 o'clock, I rode out toward the ranger station. The dirt road curved through spruce stands where the light flickered in strips across the windshield. The air smelled of warm needles and dust. I told myself I wasn't going there to report anything. I just wanted to see if anyone had logged a message from her. That was all. Nothing more. Ranger Henry Dalton was on duty when I walked in. He was sorting old paperwork at a metal desk, a mug of lemon tea steaming beside him. He was one of those men whose presence steadied a room, quiet, deliberate, always watching a little more closely than he let on. He glanced up, took one look at my face, and set his pen down. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice low and even. I told him I hadn't heard from Rachel since the night before. I tried to keep the worry out of my voice, but it kept leaking through at the edges. Henry nodded slowly, listening, the steam from his tea curling up between us. When I finished, he asked what time her call had dropped, which route she'd planned when she'd said she'd check in next. I answered everything, trying not to sound like someone clinging to details just to stay calm. "Let's give it a little while," he said, at first rubbing his thumb along the rim of the mug. "Signals on the glacier do this. You know that." He was right. I did know that. Still, I felt that same uneasy tug, like a thread running somewhere I couldn't see. I stepped back outside the station, the sun hitting my face full on. A gust carried the faint scent of river silt and the sweet tang of thawing earth. A crow landed on the railing, its claws ticking softly against the wood as it tilted its head toward me. I remember thinking it was too early in the day for the world to feel so quiet. By late afternoon, the wind picked up. Not hard, but enough to send ripples across the tall grass behind the shop and whistle faintly through the gaps in the siding of the cabins. The sky still looked clear, but there was a tension to it, like something holding its breath. I kept checking the time, feeling the day slip through my fingers faster than it should. When 5 o'clock rolled around with no call, the confusion started to harden into something heavier. Not panic, not yet, but an awareness that this wasn't following the usual script. Climbers who run behind schedule improvise, but Rachel didn't improvise her check-ins. She treated them like part of the climb, reliable, predictable, on the dot. I tried calling again, same empty ring, same dull click. I drove out to the airstrip just to get the side of the mountain in front of me. The peak looked like it always did in early summer, cold light sliding down the upper slopes, a slight shimmer where the snowpack met the sun. Nothing about it looked threatening. Nothing warned me that anything was wrong. But the longer I stared, the more that crisp beauty felt indifferent, almost mocking, as if the mountain knew something I didn't. Pilots were securing their planes for the night belts snapping taut in the wind. One of them called out a greeting. I raised a hand without turning. My attention was pulled upward toward that distant ridgeline where she'd planned to camp. I imagined her settling into her tent, melting snow for water, writing a quick note in her journal before bed. That image should have comforted me. Instead, it felt like trying to hold smoke. Around 6, my stomach told me I hadn't eaten anything all day. I went into the diner, the warm glow of the place washing over me. Smells of frying onions, old coffee burned into the pot, a hint of maple syrup from somebody's leftover breakfast plate. People talked in low voices at the counter, the kind of chatter that bounced around small towns without ever really going anywhere. I sat in a booth by the window watching dust drift through slanted beams of evening sun. I picked at a sandwich I didn't taste. My phone sat on the table screen, up like a silent accusation. Every time it lit with the dim reflection of an overhead light, my pulse kicked, thinking it might be her. It never was. At some point, Dale Harris walked in. He moved past my booth without stopping, but I felt his presence the way you feel a cold draft. He muttered something to the waitress, his voice low, a little rough from the cold air outside. When he glanced my way, it was brief, too brief almost, like he didn't want our eyes to meet. He dropped into a corner seat, hunched over shoulders, tight. The smell of machine oil followed him in, threading through the restaurant's warmer scents. I didn't speak to him. I didn't trust my own voice then. Something about him made my skin prickle, though I couldn't have said why. just another thread I didn't know to pull. Outside, the light had turned to deeper gold shadows, stretching long across the gravel. I stepped into the cooling air, my breath fogging a little. That wasn't typical for early June. The breeze carried the smell of spruce and something metallic like an icy tang that didn't belong. I drove back to my cabin with the window cracked, letting the cold sting my face just to stay awake. Back home, the porch light cast its usual warm circle across the steps. I sat at the table by the window again, the room dim except for that small glow from outside. I called Henry, trying to sound composed. "No change?" he asked. "No change." There was a pause long enough that I heard the soft creak of his chair as he leaned back. "If we don't hear anything by morning," he said quietly, "we'll treat it as overdue and move from there." That was the moment the bottom dropped out. Hearing him say the word overdue turned all my private worry into something real, tangible, cold. I didn't sleep that night. I paced the floor listening to the faint hum of the fridge, the occasional groan of the cabin settling on its beams. The sky outside the window dimmed from gold to blue to a charcoal gray that clung to the horizon even long after midnight. I poured coffee I never drank. I sat by the fire pit outside until the wind got sharp enough to push me back indoors. Around 4 a.m, a single truck drove slowly down the road, its headlights brushing across my porch before sliding away. I watched the taillights fade, leaving the world dark and empty again. Just after dawn, the phone still silent, I stepped outside. The air smelled colder, almost like early fall instead of June. A thin mist clung to the ground, drifting low over the grass. I stood in the quiet, listening for anything the river. A passing car, a plane warming up at the airstrip. Nothing came. Nothing broke the silence. Then, down the road, I saw the faint shape of a ranger's cruiser making the slow turn onto my lane. The tires crunched over the gravel, steady and unhurried. As it pulled into my driveway, the engine eased into a soft idle. Henry stepped out, closing the door with a muted thud. He didn't put his hat on right away. He just held it at his side, taking in the morning air before walking toward me. And in that moment, with the mist curling around his boots and the porch light still burning behind me, I knew the calm world I'd been living in had slipped away for good. The morning the search began, the sun had only just cleared the ridgeline, throwing long gold shafts across the ranger station's lot. Frost still clung to the grass, fragile and white, crunching under the boots of deputies moving quietly between their trucks. The air carried that thin metallic chill you only get on early summer mornings up here, when the heat hasn't yet pushed its way back into the world. I stood off to the side, arms folded tight against my chest, watching Henry Dalton speak to 2 younger rangers beside a map spread across a tailgate. Their breath came out in pale puffs. Radios crackled softly. It was the sound of a routine that had been practiced too many times. Henry caught my eye and gave a small nod, professional, controlled, but with an undercurrent I recognized after years of working beside him. This wasn't a give it a few hours situation anymore. This was official. The kind of escalation where paperwork is replaced by boots on the ground and where silence becomes a warning instead of an inconvenience. As the team prepared, I felt a quiet shift inside me, the kind that presses down on your ribs. It wasn't just worry now. It was the realization that whatever had happened out there was no longer in Rachel's hands. We were stepping into a different kind of search, one that looks for signs rather than people. Within an hour, we were airborne. The helicopter's rotors beat a hard rhythm into the cold air, sending loose snow swirling in white spirals across the glacier as we lifted off. The smell of jet fuel mixed with the sharp bite of wind that came through the open side door. From above, the Kahiltna looked deceptively calm, broad plains of ice cut by dark, jagged crevasses that stretched like ink running down a page. Even after all these years, that view still humbled me. It reminded you how small a person really was out there. We followed the track toward the intermediate camp where she'd planned to spend her first night. As we descended, the engine noise softened into a deeper hum echoing off the high walls of ice. When the skids touched down, the helicopter settled with a shudder, sending a puff of powdery snow into the air. Her camp was easy to spot. The bright orange tent stood out against the white, its guy lines neat and evenly spaced, the fabric barely rippling in the wind. It looked untouched, too untouched. A stove sat on a small ledge beside the tent, fuel canisters arranged with the kind of order only Rachel bothered with. Her spare rope hung coiled where she'd placed it. Nothing was scattered, overturned, or buried. No signs of a struggle. No gear torn loose by weather. Inside the tent, I knelt on the hardened snow floor and ran my fingers along her sleeping bag. It was still rolled tight, never used. The faint chemical smell of nylon and cold metal filled the air. Her headlamp lay beside her journal, exactly where she'd said she'd put it before leaving. Everything about the camp spoke of preparation and intention. Not panic, not haste, not a person who'd suddenly lost control of her climb. We followed the faint trail of crampon marks leading away from camp. They were shallow at first, like she'd been moving slowly, testing the snow. Then the tracks angled toward a darker patch of ice where meltwater had carved narrow channels through the surface. The wind whistled through the cracks as we walked, carrying a damp chill up from the depths. One of the rangers pointed at something, a single indentation deeper than the rest, almost like she'd hesitated there. But the marks were faint, nearly erased by wind and drifting snow. A little farther on, the prints simply vanished. Not faded. Vanished. The ice beyond that point was a smooth blue-gray sheet, a clean break, as though someone had lifted her straight off the surface or as if she'd stepped off the edge of something that wasn't visible from where we stood. Henry crouched beside the last clear imprint, running his glove across the ice. He didn't say anything at first, just breathed slowly, the fog of it drifting sideways in the wind. Then, in a voice meant only for those closest, he said, "She didn't just walk off." The rest of the team fanned out. Volunteers arrived through the afternoon guides, pilots, even a few folks from town who knew the terrain well enough to help. The sound of footsteps crunching in snow mixed with the clipped instructions coming over radios. Dogs were brought in their harnesses, jingling as handlers spoke to them in low, measured tones. The dogs worked in widening circles, noses down, tails stiff, but each time they paused to indicate something. The trail dissolved almost as soon as it appeared. They'd walk a few yards, stop, lift their heads, confused. The scent ended abruptly in places where it shouldn't have. By evening, the wind had picked up again, sweeping loose snow into shifting veils that blurred the horizon. Maps were rolled out across the hoods of trucks parked at the lower staging area. Lanterns glowed against the cold dusk, casting warm circles of light across the topographical lines. Henry traced a finger along potential detours, gullies she might have used descent points if she'd turned back early. Each option looked plausible at a glance. Each one felt wrong when we walked it. Theories started forming soft at first. Maybe she'd missed a snow bridge. Maybe she'd fallen into a hidden crevasse. Maybe the warm spell had undermined the ice in ways we couldn't see. Each explanation sounded reasonable, but they didn't match the facts. Her gear was intact. Her precautions had all been made. There was no evidence of a fall, no torn straps, no dragged marks, no debris caught in surface cracks. Even the camp itself felt staged by the mountain, almost too perfect to belong to someone who'd run into trouble. Down in town, the murmurs began. I heard them at the diner when I stopped for a late-night coffee, the kind without flavor, but enough to keep your eyes open. A couple of locals leaned in close over their plates, voices low, talking about old stories from the range guides who disappeared for days only to reappear somewhere unexpected. Climbers who'd walked straight into whiteouts that swallowed their tracks behind them. Rumors always surface when fear does. A few mentioned that part of the glacier had been acting odd for years, hollow in ways the weather couldn't account for. One old-timer swore there were melt pockets big enough to hide a cabin inside. Folks listened, nodded, kept their eyes on their food. When I walked past, the conversations quieted. Back on the mountain, the search grid expanded. We combed valleys and checked narrow ice corridors where sound died in your throat. A drone hovered overhead, its faint buzz carried off by the wind as it scanned for heat signatures or disruptions in the surface layers. Each time it landed, the tech shook his head. Nothing. Just endless shades of blue and white. At one point, a volunteer yelled that he'd found something. We rushed over snow crunching loud beneath our boots. The object lay half buried near a ridge. My heart stuttered when I saw the bright scrap of red, but when we brushed the snow aside, it turned out to be the corner of an old jacket long discarded by some unknown climber years ago, sun-faded, torn, useless. Not hers. Not anything helpful. That was how the search went. For every spark of possibility, a bucket of cold water waited. Later, near dusk on the second day, the dogs picked up a scent trail moving toward a cluster of fractured ice pillars. My pulse quickened as we followed the air heavy with that faint mineral smell of meltwater. But just as before, the trail ended in a clean break. No prints. No scraps. No gear. It was like chasing shadows. The weight of it all began to sink into me. I felt it in the stiffness of my shoulders, the ache in my jaw from clenching too hard. Sleep came in short bursts, haunted by images of her standing alone in the wind, calling out for a voice that didn't answer. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the last clear track in the ice the moment her presence still existed in the world and the blank expanse beyond it. Fears turned corners in my mind, not just about falls or weather or unseen gaps in the glacier, but about people. About things that could move quietly in the same wilderness we trusted with our lives. At the time, it felt paranoid to think that way. But more than once, I caught Henry looking out over the terrain with a focus that didn't match the usual accident scenario. He didn't voice it. None of us did. But the question hung there unspoken. What if someone else had been out there? The third night brought a new cold sharp enough to sting the inside of your nose. The sky above the peaks was a deep, bruised blue, the stars distant and small. At the staging area, lanterns flickered against the wind, making shadows jump along the snowbanks. Volunteers huddled around maps, rubbing their gloved hands, their breath forming clouds that drifted upward and vanished. The radios were mostly quiet now, voices dulled by fatigue. I stood near the tailgate of Henry's truck, staring at the grid lines we'd traced earlier. The lines crossed and doubled back, tightening into knots over sections we'd already searched again and again. The glacier can trick you like that, make you feel like you're circling the same ground no matter how far you walk. My eyes felt gritty, my throat dry despite the numb air. That's when Henry approached. His coat rustled softly as he came up beside me. He didn't speak right away. He just placed a small marker on the map, an orange pin hovering over a section near the lower melt channels. His expression was thoughtful, narrowed slightly as he studied the terrain. Something about that placement unsettled me. It wasn't an area we'd marked as high risk. It wasn't even on her original route. He finally exhaled a long, low breath. "We need to take a closer look here tomorrow," he said softly. "Something's not lining up." His tone wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even urgent. It was quieter than that, almost resigned, as if he'd been circling this thought for hours and had finally let it surface. The lantern beside us flickered in the wind, throwing his shadow long across the snow. And for the first time since Rachel disappeared, I felt the distinct sense that we were no longer searching for a simple explanation. We were walking toward something deeper, colder, and far more deliberate than any of us wanted to admit. I didn't know it then, but that small orange pin on the map was the first hint of the truth waiting beneath the ice. The morning we found her, the air had that strange stillness that comes before a shift you can't name. The sky was a flat, muted blue, and the cold hung low to the ground, clinging to the edges of every footprint pressed into the snow. We were back on the glacier heading toward the area Henry had marked the night before with that small orange pin. Nothing about the place looked any different from the dozens of sections we'd combed already wind-scoured ridges, thin channels of meltwater threading through the ice pockets of shadow that swallowed the morning light whole. But every person in that line carried a quiet weight, as if we'd crossed from searching for answers to bracing for them. We spread out slowly, boots crunching on the frozen surface. The dogs moved ahead, their breath puffing out in rhythmic bursts. Radios murmured updates, nothing urgent, nothing promising. I kept my eyes low, scanning for any irregularity, a scrap of cloth, a broken strap, even the faintest shift in color that didn't match the ice. The wind cut across the plain in small, bitter drafts, sending a sting through my fingertips, even inside my gloves. About an hour into the sweep, a sharp call cracked across the radio, too abrupt to be routine. The tone alone made my stomach drop. It came from one of the younger rangers on the far side of the fissures. He didn't shout. He didn't repeat himself. He just said, "You'd better come see this." Everything around me seemed to narrow. The helicopter pilot who'd been standing beside the gear pile adjusting straps froze mid-motion. Henry looked up sharply, the line of his jaw tightening. He didn't say anything, just motioned for me and the nearest team members to follow him. We crossed the ice in silence, the wind pushing faint grains of snow across our boots. When we reached the ridge where the call had originated, I saw 3 people clustered around a dip in the glacier, not a crevasse exactly, but a place where the ice had thinned and begun to form an opening shaped by years of meltwater. The air spilling from that space was noticeably colder, sharp enough to sting the back of your throat. A low hum, almost like the quiet breathing of the glacier itself, rose from the opening. The ranger who'd radioed us didn't meet my eyes. He just stepped aside, lifting his chin toward the opening. "There's a cavity down there," he said quietly. Bigger than it looked at first. We clipped into ropes, one by one, the metal snicking softly in the cold air. The climber assigned to safety went first, easing into the narrow space boots, scraping gently along the ice walls. The deeper he went, the quieter everything seemed to become, as though sound itself couldn't settle in that cold. When my turn came, I inhaled once slowly, letting the frozen air burn through my lungs, then lowered into the dim blue light beneath the surface. The cave opened suddenly beneath me, an oval chamber carved by time and thaw. The walls were a clear glass-like blue, so transparent in places you could see pockets of ancient air suspended like trapped stars. The floor was smooth wet in spots where meltwater traced silver lines. My headlamp swept across the far side, and something dark caught the beam, a shape embedded high in the ice overhead. It took my eyes a moment to adjust. At first it looked like a shadow, maybe a trick of refracted light. But then the outline sharpened, the slope of a shoulder, the bend of an elbow, the faint shine of fabric caught in the frozen wall. I felt my breath hitch. My gloved hand tightened around the rope without meaning to. Someone above whispered my name over the radio. I couldn't bring myself to answer. Henry reached the bottom of the rope and stepped beside me. His light tilted upward, slowly, controlled, steady. The beam traced the contours of the figure in the ice upside down, suspended several feet above us, the legs angled toward the mouth of the cave, the head buried deeper in the wall. Red fabric, dark hair, a strap frozen across one shoulder. It didn't matter that the face was obscured. I knew. My knees felt loose, unstable. The cold in that cave seeped through every layer of clothing, settling in my bones. For a few seconds, all I heard was the faint drip of water somewhere near the back of the chamber, each drop echoing like a ticking clock. Henry stayed quiet beside me. His voice, when it finally came, was soft. "We found her." The world didn't collapse. It didn't break apart. It simply narrowed into a tunnel of sound and sensation, the cold against my face, the sterile smell of nylon from my jacket, the faint static on the radio lines above us. I'd spent days imagining where she might be clinging to hope, even when logic told me otherwise. But I had never imagined this quiet, deliberate placement, as if someone had taken time to set her there. The climbing rope around her waist was visible through the ice, cut cleanly, not frayed, not torn, a precision you don't find in accidents. A fragment of metal glinted near her hand, what looked like a carabiner frozen in place. When the light hit it just right, you could see a faint shape etched into the worn paint, something like a wing or maybe an eagle. I felt a pinch in my chest as recognition flared. I'd seen that emblem before, more than once. The investigative team worked with a kind of reverent caution, speaking in low voices so they wouldn't disturb the fragile air. They spread their tools out carefully, the clink of metal against ice sounding impossibly loud. Every movement sent small vibrations through the cave's soft tremors you could feel in your boots. Once the immediate shock faded, the forensic steps began. Photographs from every angle, measurements, notes scribbled with numb hands. The headlamps cast slow-moving shadows across the walls, making the figure seem to shift in the ice, even though it was perfectly still. When they started extracting the section of ice containing her body, I stepped back to give them space. My palms were sweating inside my gloves despite the cold. My throat felt thick. A memory hit me, a simple one. Her sitting on my porch weeks earlier, the evening sun warming her face, tapping her thumb absently against her mug as we talked about routes. The contrast was so sharp it almost hurt. The autopsy would come later back in town. But even on the glacier, the clues from the ice were clear. The position of her body, the cut rope, the absence of her pack, none of it fit the shape of an accident. This wasn't the mountain taking someone as it sometimes does in brutal but natural ways. This was human. Back at the staging area, the mood changed instantly. The hum of conversation dimmed. Radios clicked with clipped urgency. Someone draped a blanket around my shoulders without a word. I didn't feel the warmth. Henry stood near the helicopter, speaking quietly into his radio, his breath steady, controlled. But the way he kept rubbing the edge of his wedding band with his thumb told me he was shaken too. It didn't take long for investigators from Fairbanks to arrive. Their vehicles rolled up in a slow, measured line, tires crunching over the frost. They stepped out wearing heavy jackets and unreadable expressions, setting out case boxes and equipment with practiced efficiency. One of them, an older detective with silver hair, approached me gently, asking if I needed a moment before he started asking questions. His voice was calm-low, the kind used for families standing at fresh graves. While teams worked inside the mobile command tent, I sat on the back bumper of a pickup, watching the sky shift from pale blue to the kind of bright white that signals more cold coming. Every now and then, I'd catch myself holding my breath, letting it out slowly, doing it again. Word reached her parents overseas before the day was out. I wasn't there when they got the call, but Henry told me the line went silent for a long time. Her mother finally said thank you in a voice he described as soft and hollow. I felt that settle somewhere deep inside me. The bigger truth came together over the next few days, piece by piece, like a map unfolding. Forensic teams worked through her equipment, or what was left of it. They studied the angle of the rope, the shape of the wound hidden beneath the ice. When the autopsy confirmed the injury at the base of her skull, clean, precise, consistent with a sharp tool wielded with force, no one reacted loudly. They just wrote it down. A fact. A truth we could no longer skirt around. And then the other evidence surfaced. The old carabiner embedded near her shoulder matched one found later in a mechanic's trailer back near Healy. A receipt tied him to equipment bought the week of her disappearance. His phone held photographs of the very stream she'd visited, images taken at a distance but clear enough to show a figure in a red jacket on the slope. When he confessed, the words came out flat and emotionless. He said he hadn't meant for it to go so far. He blamed panic. But his story tied a second man into the plot, a former guide who'd been running an illegal grow operation hidden beneath the tree line, terrified she'd expose it. Money had kept the mechanic quiet. Something darker had kept him obedient. Hearing the chain of events laid out made the room feel smaller around me. My breath felt thin. It wasn't the mountain that took her. It was a choice. A deliberate act by two men who knew the wilderness well enough to hide a body inside the ice and trust time to bury the rest. When the arrests were finally made, the sound of the handcuffs clinking shut didn't feel triumphant. It felt heavy, like a weight dropping into the pit of my stomach. That evening, after the crime scene had been cleared, and the last helicopter lifted off with her remains encased in insulated panels, I stood alone on the edge of the glacier. The cold wind pushed against me, carrying the faint scent of snow and aircraft fuel. The sun hovered low, staining the ice with pale orange light. Behind me, rangers packed equipment with quiet hands, the soft thud of gear hitting truck beds echoing in the stillness. Henry approached me from behind, footsteps slow, deliberate. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said enough: exhaustion, sorrow, and something like resolve all tangled together. "We'll take it from here," he said, finally, his voice low. I nodded once, letting the cold settle deeper into me. The day felt endless, and yet unfinished, like we were standing in the doorway of something that hadn't fully arrived. By the time I climbed into the passenger seat of the Ranger truck, the sky had dimmed into a deep, bruised blue. The engine hummed beneath us as Henry drove toward town, the road stretching ahead in a thin ribbon of snow and shadow. Behind us, the lights of the command tent flickered against the ice like distant stars. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Ahead of us waited the interviews, the statements, the courtrooms, the long nights spent unpacking every piece of what had happened. But in that moment, all I could feel was the heavy truth of it settling across my shoulders. A truth that would follow me into every day that came after. In the hours after we brought her out of the glacier, everything around me moved in a kind of muffled slow motion, as if sound had trouble finding its way through the cold. The investigators formed a guarded ring around the insulated container, holding her remains, their breath rising in small white plumes as they spoke in clipped, deliberate tones. A few rangers stood off to the side, hats in their hands, their eyes fixed on the snow at their feet. No one said much. There was a sense that anything louder than a murmur might break something fragile in the air. Her parents were notified before the sun went down. I didn't hear the call myself, but later that night one of the state detectives told me the line had fallen silent for so long he wasn't sure they were still there. When her mother finally spoke, her voice came out thin and distant, like someone reaching through a long tunnel. She didn't ask for details. She didn't ask about the investigation. She only asked if her daughter had been found intact and if we had treated her gently. The detective told her we had. Even the hardened officers nearby bowed their heads at that. Back in town, word spread faster than any of us could contain. The diner closed early. The small motel on the highway dimmed its neon sign out of respect. When I walked into the ranger station the next morning, I found a few of the older guides gathered around the bulletin board coffee cups held close to their chests. They weren't talking, just standing there staring at a map of the glacier with pins marking the areas we'd searched. Someone had laid a single red bandana on the corner of the board. No one claimed responsibility for placing it there. Once the arrests were made, the investigation turned from speculation to something sharper. The mechanic from Healy Greer barely resisted. He looked hollow when they brought him into Fairbanks, like he'd spent years preparing for consequences he knew would come eventually. His confession came out cold, matter-of-fact, almost tired. He described his part in all of it, how he'd followed her that day, how a single blow had changed the course of too many lives. He told it without flourish, without apology, as if reciting the steps of a job he wished he hadn't taken. But the weight of the story didn't settle until the second man was caught, the former guide who'd run the hidden grow operation. When they found him on that shoreline near Sitka, sitting by the water like he'd been waiting for them, Something inside me felt both vindicated and profoundly hollow. He never raised his voice during interrogation. He spoke clearly, almost politely, about the choices he'd made and why he thought they were necessary. That calmness made it worse, made it feel calculated, chilling, like he'd stepped outside the boundaries of normal human feeling years before any of us knew his name. Their trials were straightforward. The evidence was a chain with no weak links receipts, transfers the photos on the mechanic's phone, her diary taken from the cabinet where it had been hidden. When the prosecutor read the final pieces of the case into the record, the courtroom went still enough that you could hear the soft buzz of the overhead lights. I sat in the back row, hands folded in my lap, and watched as the verdicts rolled out like slow, heavy stones hitting the floor. There was no celebration. Oh, only a collective exhale, long and weary. Her parents flew in for the sentencing. I met them outside the courthouse on a cold April afternoon. Her mother wore a small silver pin on her coat, shaped like a mountain peak. She wrapped her arms around me without hesitation, holding on for a long moment. She didn't cry. Neither did I. We just stood there while the wind pushed softly against us, carrying the faint smell of thawing earth. After the case closed, life in our little town shifted in quiet ways. Folks still went to work, still stopped for diesel at the station, still waved at neighbors on the 2-lane road that runs toward the foothills. But there was a heaviness that settled into the place, something that made people look a little longer at the mountains each morning. The trails she used to run were folded back into the landscape, but no one walked them alone for a long while. Even now, years later, I notice people pausing at certain trailheads just long enough to gather their breath as if remembering her before stepping forward. The glacier itself changed too, though in ways only those of us who knew it well could see. The cave where she'd been found collapsed the following season, swallowed by meltwater and sunlight. The entrance vanished. The walls softened, the chamber reduced to a seam of pale blue ice. If you walked past it now, you'd never know there'd once been a space large enough to hold a person's secrets. Nature erases with an indifference that can feel merciful or merciless, depending on the day. For me, the years that followed were a strange blend of steadiness and ache. I returned to guiding, though, with a different kind of quiet inside me. My routes became more methodical. My checklists grew longer. I found myself teaching younger climbers not just about technique, but about intuition. The subtle shifts in weather, the odd tracks near a ridge, the sound of snow settling in a way that warns you to stop moving. I suppose that was my way of honoring her, of keeping her presence stitched into each climb. There are moments that still pull me back without warning. A gust of cold air funneling through a ravine. The hollow ring of metal on ice. The sight of a red jacket in the distance, even if it's just another hiker making their way up a slope. Sometimes I feel her near on those mornings in the stillness of dawn when the sun paints the snow a pale gold. Not as a ghost or a voice, just a steady feeling like a hand resting lightly on my shoulder. Every so often I visit the spot where the ridge overlooks the glacier. It's quiet there. The wind moves in long, low breaths, almost like the mountain exhaling. I bring a small thermos of coffee, sit on the same boulder, and let the cold seep into me. It's a way of remembering without reopening the wound. A way of honoring the life she lived, not just the way it ended. Her family established a small memorial fund in her name, meant to support search operations across the state. Henry and I helped set it up. The first time a check from that fund paid for fuel on a winter rescue, I felt something shift, a small, bittersweet sense of purpose threading its way through the grief. Sometimes people ask me what stays with me the most. I never tell them about the cave or the autopsy or the courtroom. Those details belong to a different part of the story, one that doesn't fit easily into casual conversation. What stays with me is simpler. It's the memory of her last morning heading out onto the glacier, boots crunching on the snow breath rising in quiet puffs, her eyes focused on the route ahead. She had a way of moving that made the mountains seem like part of her, as if she carried their calm in her pocket. The final image I hold isn't the one from the cave. It's that first step she took onto the ice, steady and sure, the sky opening above her in a wide sweep of blue. That's the piece I carry with me when the days grow heavy, the reminder of who she was before anything went wrong. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.